Rain poured down like a waterfall across Chicago's Gold Coast, turning the streets into rivers reflecting neon lights and car headlights. Inside Bellissimo, the city's most exclusive Italian restaurant, the storm was nothing more than a distant soundtrack, raindrops tapping gently against the tall glass windows that separated the wealthy diners from the chaos of the outside world. Dominic Caruso sat alone at his usual corner table, a position that allowed him to observe both entrances and the kitchen door clearly. Old habits. After 15 years in the business, certain instincts had become as natural as breathing. The table was set for one as it had been every Thursday evening for the past 6 months. White tablecloth, fresh roses in a crystal vase, a bottle of wine already open to breathe beside an untouched glass. He was 37 years old, though the weight of his decisions made him feel much older. His black suit was impeccable, tailored at Armani during his last trip to Milan. His dark hair was cut short and neat, and his storm gray eyes, eyes that had witnessed things that would keep others awake for a lifetime, now stared into empty space. To anyone watching, he looked like a successful businessman enjoying a quiet dinner. They could not see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders carried an invisible burden that grew heavier with each passing year. Dominic had not come here to eat. He came to think, to remember, to say goodbye to a life he had built brick by brick, decision by decision, until the structure had grown so tall he could no longer see the ground. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation. Smooth jazz played from hidden speakers. Frank Sinatra, My Way. Dominic recognized the song. His mother had played it constantly when he was young, when life was simpler, when he was still a 12-year-old boy who knew nothing of blood and power, when he still had choices. "Good evening, Mr. Caruso." The voice pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to find a woman he had never seen before standing beside his table. She wore the standard server uniform: white shirt, black vest, black slacks. But there was something about her that did not quite fit. Perhaps it was the way she stood, balanced and alert, like someone ready to move at any moment. Or perhaps it was her eyes, dark brown, intelligent, and far too observant for someone simply taking orders. She was around 27, he guessed, dark brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Olive skin, high cheekbones, beautiful but not in the delicate, fragile way of the usual servers here. There was a strength in her features, a quiet confidence that made him take notice, and hidden beneath that calm exterior was something deeper, as if she had seen hell and survived to tell the tale. "I have not seen you here before." Dominic said, his voice still carrying a trace of the South Side accent he had never quite lost despite years of trying. "First week," she replied, placing a menu in front of him, though they both knew he did not need it. "My name is Belle. I will be taking care of you this evening." Belle. He tested the name, noticing the slight emphasis she placed on the first syllable. "French-Spanish, actually. My mother was from Barcelona." She smiled, but the smile did not reach her eyes. "But I grew up here, Miami." Dominic nodded, slowly studying her face. He had spent 15 years reading people, learning to see through the masks they wore. This woman was wearing several layers of masks, and when her sleeve rode up slightly as she set down the water glass, he caught a glimpse of a faded scar on her wrist, the scar of someone who had once wanted to end it all. When she turned to leave, then paused, looking at him with those observant eyes, she said softly that 8 years of waiting tables in different cities had taught her how to read people. She had learned to recognize tourists, first dates, business deals, celebrations, and she had learned to recognize those who were saying goodbye to something. For a long moment, Dominic said nothing. The jazz continued its melancholy progression. The rain grew heavier against the windows. Somewhere in the restaurant, someone laughed, a sound that seemed to come from an entirely different world. "You are very perceptive," he finally said. "It is a gift, sometimes a curse." Belle's expression softened slightly, as if his words touched something deep within her. "Whatever you are wrestling with, I hope you find your answer." She walked away before he could respond, disappearing into the kitchen with a grace that seemed practiced through hundreds of missions. Dominic watched her go, feeling unsettled in a way he could not name. Something about her presence had shifted the air in the room, like a barometric change before a storm. Who was this woman, and why did he have the feeling that this chance encounter would change everything he had ever known? Before the story continues, if you find yourself wondering about this mysterious woman and longing to know what will unfold next, Take a quiet moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications so you will not miss any of the tender, soul-stirring stories we share each day. And a simple like or share from you will help this tale travel farther than you might imagine, reaching people who need a moment of solace or reflection. And I cannot help but wonder where you are listening from right now. So leave a comment with the name of your city or your country below to let me know how far our story has journeyed across the world. And now let us return to Dominic and the woman named Belle, because what is about to happen will alter the course of both their lives forever. Belle slipped behind the kitchen door, yet her presence lingered in the air like a trace of perfume that refuses to fade. And Dominic poured himself a glass of red wine, letting the stem rest between his fingers as he watched the deep crimson swirl the way old memories rise slowly from the darkest corners of the mind. And it had been 15 years. 15 long and brutal years since the night everything changed. A night he could still see with painful clarity, the phone ringing at 2 in the morning, the voice of a police officer cold and apologetic as he reported a highway crash. His parents killed instantly when a drunk driver in a pickup truck veered across the lane and struck their car. The driver fleeing the scene never found, and Dominic, only 22, then freshly graduated, standing on the edge of an ordinary future that would never come to pass, held his baby sister in a house that suddenly felt too large and unbearably silent. Lucia, only 2 years old, still too young to understand why their mother was not coming home anymore, why their father would never lift her high above his head again and laugh. And Dominic looked into her innocent eyes and made himself a promise that he would do everything to protect her, everything, without knowing that such a vow would pull him into the shadows he once thought he could avoid, because the Caruso family had long been connected to powerful men in the city. Ties his father had been trying to sever but never managed to finish. And when his parents died, those men came knocking, offering help, offering protection, offering ways to earn money to raise his sister. And Dominic refused the first time, the second time, the third time. But the savings dwindled, the bills piled up, and Lucia needed milk, needed diapers, needed medicine when she got sick, and he took his first job on a rainy night. Much like this one, only delivering a message. Only something small. Only something temporary. And 15 years later, he sat here, as one of the most powerful men in Chicago, with hands stained by things that would never wash clean, while Lucia, now 17, attended the finest private school in the city and dreamed of becoming a doctor, unaware of where her tuition came from, unaware of what foundation her luxurious penthouse rested upon, unaware of who her beloved older brother truly was. And Dominic intended to keep it that way, which was why he had chosen to withdraw beginning 6 months ago, to hand over operations, to trim down activities, to prepare for a life far away from all this. A life where he could take Lucia, once she entered college next year, and start again in a place where no one knew the name Caruso. But in his world, retreat was never simple, and the familiar sound of footsteps pulled him out of his thoughts as Vincent DeLuca sat across from him, without waiting to be invited, the privilege of a man who had stood beside him for 12 years. 52 years old, with silver hair and a weathered face shaped by too many things a man should never witness, a mentor, a guide, the closest thing Dominic had to a father after his own died. And Vincent's voice dropped into a somber timbre as he said they needed to talk. And Dominic took a slow sip of wine, waiting while Vincent scanned the room and leaned in, explaining that some were displeased with Dominic's decision, that the Moretti family saw his withdrawal as a sign of weakness and were eyeing their territory. And Frank Moretti's name tightened Dominic's grip on the glass, because that old vulture had long wanted to swallow Chicago whole, simply waiting for an opportunity. But Vincent's tone grew even heavier as he added that Frank's son Nathan had begun quietly reaching out to men within their own organization, that there were those who wanted a change in leadership, believing Dominic had lost his fire. And Dominic set the glass down as his gray eyes chilled to steel, demanding to know who, but Vincent could not yet give him names, only warnings urging him not to go anywhere alone, not to trust anyone, not even him if it came to that. And Dominic looked at the man who had taught him everything, who had saved his life more times than he could count, unaware that this very warning would one day pass through the lips of the person who would betray him, while outside the rain kept falling, as if the sky itself mourned what was coming. And in the restaurant kitchen, a woman with deep brown eyes listened to every word through a tiny transmitter hidden inside her pocket. Belle leaned her back against the kitchen wall, the tiny earpiece pressed close to her ear as she listened to every word exchanged between Dominic and Vincent DeLuca, committing to memory each detail, each name, each threat, each whisper of a retreat that would shape the case because this was what the FBI needed. The fragments required to complete the picture of the Caruso empire. Yet something in Dominic's voice kept pulling her focus away. Something weary, something hollow, and most unexpected of all, something tender when he spoke of his sister. And she removed the earpiece and slipped it into her pocket before moving to the sink. Turning on the faucet and letting the cold water run across her trembling fingers, as if the chill could steady her and Isabel Navarro. That was her real name, the name she had buried 15 years ago alongside the bodies of her parents and the memory of her little brother, because Belle was only a shell, one of many she had worn to survive. And when she closed her eyes the way she always did when the defenses dropped, the past rose like a crashing tide, dragging her back to that night in Miami when she was 12 years old and doing homework in her room. As the front door was kicked open, her father shouting for her mother to run, gunshots splitting the air, and she ran into the hallway just in time to see her father sprawled in a pool of blood. His eyes open and fixed on her, as if trying to speak one last thing he no longer had time to say. While her mother was dragged into the living room by two men, and her 8-year-old brother Daniel screamed as another man lifted him like an object, and Belle hid inside the closet of her parents' bedroom, holding her breath, peering through the narrow slit of the door, as she heard her mother begging, then screaming, then falling silent, and she heard Daniel calling her name again and again until his voice drifted farther and farther away before vanishing entirely. And she stayed in that darkness for 6 hours, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, until the police found her clutching her mother's shirt, her eyes wide open but seeing nothing, and they told her that the attackers belonged to the Moretti family, a criminal organization her father had been investigating, and they told her Daniel had been sold into a trafficking ring and never recovered, and they told her she was lucky to be alive. Lucky. And Belle opened her eyes now to look at the face in the small kitchen mirror, the face of a stranger who had learned to hide every emotion behind a calm mask, a woman who joined the FBI at 21 with a single purpose: to destroy families like the Morettis and the Carusos, the people who had stolen her childhood, her family, and her ability to love or trust. Yet after 3 weeks of watching Dominic Caruso, she had begun to see things that never appeared in the files: the way he refused to touch drugs or trafficking, the two most profitable crimes, the way he treated his employees with respect rather than fear, the way he spoke of his sister with the voice of a father instead of a brother. And tonight, the way he looked at her when she mentioned the people he was saying goodbye to, as though she had brushed against a wound buried deep inside him, and she knew she should not care, because he was still a criminal, still part of the same world that had destroyed her own. But as she looked through the small window between the kitchen and the dining room, and saw Dominic sitting alone after Vincent left, his shoulders slightly bent, as if carrying the weight of the world, she wondered whether the line between good and evil was ever as sharp as she once believed. And more unsettling still, she wondered why her heart beat faster every time those storm-gray eyes turned toward her. The night never truly ended for Belle. It simply repeated itself over and over every night, every time she closed her eyes, every time she heard a door slam or a distant shout. And after the police found her, curled inside the closet, they took her to a hospital, then to social services, and then to her first foster home, where she did not speak a single word for 3 months, and the doctors called it psychological trauma, though Belle understood something far simpler: that she had died with her family that night, and only her body had forgotten to stop breathing. And the first foster family in Tampa, a middle-aged couple who took children for the subsidy checks, fed her enough but never looked her in the eye, treating her like a piece of walking furniture. While the second home was worse, the foster father drinking each night and using his belt to discipline children who did not listen. And the first scar on Belle's back came from that house, a long line running from her shoulder to her hip, a souvenir from the night she tried to shield another foster child from his rage. And she was moved only after a teacher saw the wound and reported it. Yet no one asked if she was all right. No one held her. No one told her things would get better. and the third, fourth, and fifth families blurred together like washed-out frames in an old film, during which she learned to become invisible. Learned not to cry, learned to sleep with a small knife beneath her pillow, and at 14, living with the sixth family, she held a blade to her wrist for the first time in a bathroom. Not because she wanted to die, she believed she already had, but because she wanted to feel something, anything beyond the numbness that had wrapped itself around her for 2 years. And as the blood slid into the white sink, Belle cried for the first time since the night in Miami. And her foster mother found her unconscious on the floor, and she was placed in a psychiatric facility for 3 months before being transferred to her seventh and final home. Margaret and Thomas Chen, an older Asian couple without children, whose eyes were the gentlest Belle had ever seen, and they did not try to fix her. They simply stayed patient and quiet, letting her know she was not alone. And Margaret taught her to cook while Thomas taught her martial arts, saying that physical strength would help her reclaim the strength of her spirit. And for the first time in 4 years, Belle began to speak again, telling them about her parents, about Daniel, about the night everything ended, about her dream of finding her brother, and her hunger to destroy the people who had taken everything from her. And Thomas looked at her with a sad, steady gaze and told her that revenge was a double-edged blade that would wound her far more deeply than the enemy. But Belle did not listen. And at 18, she left the Chen's home with a promise to return, went to college, studied psychology and criminology, and applied to the FBI the moment she was old enough. And at 23, she fell in love with Ryan, a fellow agent, the first person who made her believe she might be able to feel normal again. But he died in a raid on a Moretti facility when a bullet tore through his chest before Belle could shout a warning, and she held him in a pool of blood as the light dimmed in his eyes and the 12-year-old inside her lost someone she loved all over again. And at 25, the FBI located Daniel's file, revealing that her brother had died after 2 years in a trafficking ring, dying of exhaustion and malnutrition at the age of 10. And she read the report alone in her office before walking calmly into the restroom and shattering the mirror with her fist, earning the second scar on her hand that day, and now at 27. Belle stood in the kitchen of Bellissimo, looking toward the man with the storm-gray eyes, and wondered whether she had enough humanity left to tell the difference between duty and something far more dangerous. The second week passed, and Dominic found himself returning to Bellissimo, not only on Thursday evenings anymore, for on Tuesday, he came to review the books with the owner of the restaurant, one of the legitimate businesses he possessed, and on Friday he stopped by to meet a partner, a perfectly valid reason. Yet on Sunday he had no reason at all, only that his feet carried him there before his mind caught up. And each time he sat at the same familiar corner table, and each time Belle ended up serving him as though she had arranged it that way, and their conversations, which began as brief exchanges about the weather or the food or other harmless nothings, gradually lengthened and deepened. For Belle possessed a way of listening that made a man want to speak, her dark brown eyes fixed fully on him without judgment or impatience. And when she asked about his work, Dominic offered a vague answer about being in investments, and she did not pry, only nodded with a half-smile that suggested she knew he was lying, but chose not to care. And one night when the restaurant had quieted, she lingered beside his table longer than usual, and they spoke about music, and Dominic was surprised to learn she loved classic jazz. The same music he cherished, the same music his mother once played on Sunday mornings, and she told him about a small bar in New Orleans where she had listened to live jazz through the night, and the way her eyes softened as she spoke revealed a moment from a life that must have been simpler than the one she lived now. Yet Dominic had not become the man he was by ignoring small details, and he began noticing curious things about Belle, the way she moved between the tables with light and balanced steps like someone trained in martial arts, the way she always positioned herself where she could see the entire room, never turning her back to the door, a habit too familiar to him because he did the same. And then on Saturday night, when a group of drunken customers began harassing the staff, Dominic witnessed something that erased all doubt that Belle was anything close to ordinary, for when one of the drunk men raised a broken bottle and moved toward her with a mean glint in his eyes, Belle did not scream or run or freeze, but instead turned in a smooth motion, so fluid it was almost invisible, catching his wrist using his own momentum to twist his arm behind his back and drive him face first onto the table. the bottle shattering harmlessly on the floor. The entire encounter lasting less than 3 seconds. And though the restaurant's security rushed in to handle the situation, Dominic no longer cared about the drunken men, for he was watching Belle, who stood there breathing steadily, not a single bead of sweat on her skin, as if she had done nothing more strenuous than pour water. And he recognized the technique she had used, a clean Krav Maga maneuver. A style taught to military units and intelligence operatives, not something an ordinary waitress learned in a weekend self-defense class. And after the intoxicated group was escorted out, Belle returned to Dominic's table with a calm face, her voice even and professional as she asked if he needed anything else. And Dominic looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, not as a beautiful woman or mysterious waitress, but as a riddle waiting to be solved. And he asked where she had learned to fight like that, his tone gentle yet unable to hide his curiosity. And Belle paused for a heartbeat long enough for him to know she was choosing her answer, and finally said her foster father had taught her that he believed a young woman living alone should know how to protect herself. And Dominic nodded, though he did not believe a single word. Yet he did not press her, for everyone had their secrets, and he of all people understood the necessity of masks. And what unsettled him was not that she kept hers, but that he wanted to know what lay beneath them, and that her presence made him feel more alive than anything had in many long years. At the same time, on the other side of the city, inside an abandoned warehouse in the industrial stretch of Southside, Vincent DeLuca stepped out of his car with the expression of a man who had already sold his soul to the devil, and he pulled the collar of his coat higher, scanning the area to make sure he had not been followed before slipping through the rusted steel door, where Nathan Moretti waited inside, seated on an old wooden chair, with one leg crossed over the other, and wearing the smug smile of someone convinced he was winning the game. A man 32 years old, 5 years younger than Dominic, but with ambition 10 times his size, raised by Frank Moretti, in a household that taught him to hate the Caruso family, to believe Chicago belonged to them, and that Dominic was nothing more than a thief wearing a stolen crown. And Nathan did not bother standing when Vincent entered, only said, "You're here. What news do you have for me today?" While Vincent swallowed hard disgust tightening in his throat at the man he had become. Yet he thought of his son, of the newborn grandchild, of Frank Moretti's warning that he would lose everything if he did not cooperate, because 2 years ago he had made the fatal mistake of borrowing money from the Morettis to cover gambling debts, foolishly believing he could repay it before anyone noticed. But a Moretti loan always came with a hook, and the repayment was never money. And Vincent finally managed to say that Caruso truly was withdrawing, that he had handed off most of his operations and kept only the legitimate parts. And Nathan tilted his head, his eyes sharp as ice, saying that meant the timing was perfect, that his father wanted this finished quickly, that they needed something to force Caruso to surrender the rest, and that he believed he knew exactly what that something was. And he tossed a photograph onto the table, where Vincent's heart clenched at the sight of Lucia Caruso, 17 years old, stepping through the school gate in her uniform, with a smile far too innocent for the dark world her brother inhabited. And Nathan said, his sister, Dominic Caruso's only weakness, only. "You will give me her schedule, who picks her up, where she goes after school." And Vincent shut his eyes, for he had done terrible things in his life, but never anything that felt so much like plunging headfirst into hell without a path to return. And he murmured that Lucia was only a child, that she had nothing to do with this. And Nathan replied coldly that she was involved because she was Caruso's sister, then rose to stand before Vincent with a look sharp enough to slice skin, saying Vincent had no choice, that he now belonged to them, that he would either obey or his son would learn that his father was a gambling addict, drowning in debt, who had betrayed his own boss and his infant granddaughter. She was far too small to lose. Her grandfather wasn't she? And the silence between them stretched so long, the air itself felt frozen, until Vincent finally nodded, the small motion marking the complete collapse of a man who once believed he had principles, and Nathan, preparing to leave, asked if there was anything else. And Vincent hesitated before admitting that a woman had appeared recently around Caruso, a waitress at Bellissimo named Belle, someone Dominic seemed unusually drawn to. And Nathan paused, interest flickering, as he demanded a description, and Vincent relayed everything he had observed, her dark eyes, Her unusual way of moving the fact that Dominic had been frequenting the restaurant more often since she arrived, and Nathan listened before dialing his father, speaking briefly, then hanging up with an unsettling smile, announcing that his father wanted the girl investigated, that something about her seemed wrong, and in a luxurious mansion on the outskirts of Chicago. Frank Moretti sat in his study, reviewing the background check Nathan had ordered, his 60-year-old eyes narrowing as he saw the anomaly. Isabel Navarro had no birth certificate, no school records, and no existence prior to 15 years ago. A timeline that aligned perfectly with a ghost he thought he had buried in Miami, and he whispered Thomas Navarro's daughter before saying, "Confirm it, then bring her to me." A week after the night Bell took down the drunken man, Dominic sat at his usual table on a quiet Wednesday evening. The restaurant nearly empty except for a few scattered couples, and the soft hum of jazz drifting from the speakers, and Belle set a glass of wine before him, and as she drew her hand back, her sleeve shifted just enough to reveal the faint scar on her wrist. And this time Dominic did not remain silent, for he gently took her wrist, his fingertips brushing the mark that had faded but not disappeared, the kind of scar that carried the memory of a night she would never outrun. And Belle startled but did not pull away, as though her body had grown tired of running. And Dominic said, "Tell me," his voice not a command but an invitation, quiet and patient. And Belle glanced around to be sure no one was watching before she sat in the chair across from him, breaking every rule a server should follow, but caring about none of them tonight. Because tonight she was simply a woman exhausted from wearing masks, and she began in a whisper, saying she had been 14, 2 years after her parents died, after she had cycled through 6 foster homes where no one truly wanted her, and she had been nothing more than a monthly subsidy check. And Dominic remained silent, his fingers a gentle anchor on her wrist, as though keeping her from drifting too far into memory. And she continued, saying there had been a night she could no longer bear the numbness. No joy, no sadness, no pain, no love, only a hollow shell walking and breathing. And she wanted to feel something, anything. So she picked up a knife and cut, and she paused, swallowing hard, describing how the blood had flowed, and how for the first time in 2 years she had cried, not knowing whether she cried from the pain or from the relief of finally feeling something again. And Dominic tightened his hold just slightly, not offering empty reassurances or telling her she was strong, but looking at her with storm-gray eyes full of understanding, the eyes of a man who had once stood at the edge of a similar abyss and chosen not to fall. And he told her he had been 22 when he lost his parents in a car accident on a rainy night, much like the night he first met her, and that he had a baby sister only 2 years old who did not understand why their mother was not coming home, and he had held her through the night and sworn he would do anything to protect her. And Belle looked at him, then truly looked, not as an agent observing a target, but as one human being, seeing another, recognizing in his eyes the same grief she saw in the mirror each morning. And he went on saying that everything had been impossible. And that was how he entered this world, not because he wanted power or money, but because he was desperate to keep his little sister alive when they had nothing left. And by the time he realized he had gone too far, it was already too late to turn back. And Belle said softly, more statement than question, that he planned to leave it all behind, remembering what she had heard through the recording device about his desire to give his sister a normal life. And Dominic told her he wanted Lucia to have the future. She deserved a future not overshadowed by the things he had done, adding that she wanted to become a doctor, that she wanted to save lives. And he let out a quiet, sorrowful laugh at the irony that a man like him had somehow raised a child who wanted to heal the world. And Belle felt something inside her crack the armor she had built over 15 years, breaking piece by fragile piece, because she had come here to gather evidence to send him to prison to avenge her family. Yet the man sitting before her was not the monster the FBI files described, but a brother who had sacrificed everything to raise a child. A man exhausted from carrying a life he no longer wanted, a man not so different from her. And she whispered that they were both wounded souls trying to survive in their own ways. And Dominic looked at her, and in that moment 2 walls collapsed at once. For he did not know she was an FBI agent, and she did not know he possessed such depth. Yet both understood that something had shifted between them, something neither of them would ever be able to reverse. 2 days after that night's conversation, Dominic still could not stop thinking about Belle, about the look in her eyes when she spoke of her scar, about the way she listened to his story without judgment, about the moment they looked at each other and recognized something shared between two wandering souls. And he went to Bellissimo on Saturday night without planning to meet anyone, driven only by the quiet desire to see her. And the restaurant was busier than usual, filled with laughter, the warm aroma of food, the shimmer of candlelight over white tablecloths, and Belle was serving a table near the window when she saw him walk in, their eyes meeting for a breath. And she smiled, the first smile that truly reached her eyes that he had ever seen, and he had barely taken his seat at the familiar corner table when everything changed, for the front door burst open with a violent crash, and three figures charged in, wearing black masks and carrying guns, and the room erupted into screams, chairs crashing, glass shattering across the floor, while one of the men shouted for everyone to get down and the other two swept their weapons across the room as though hunting for someone. And Dominic knew immediately that they were there for him, that this was no robbery but a message from someone who wanted him to know they could reach him anywhere at any time. And he slowly moved his hand toward the gun hidden under his jacket. But one of the masked men spotted him and roared, "Caruso," lifting his weapon. "Moretti sends his regards," and everything unfolded within seconds, yet stretched for Dominic like slow, separate frames of a nightmare. For the man pulled the trigger, and Dominic braced himself for the bullet. But instead of pain, he felt a sudden force slamming into him, knocking him to the ground. And Belle had thrown herself at him, pushing him out of the bullet's path a fraction of a second before it cut through the space where his head had been. And they hit the floor together, Dominic's back striking hard Belle's body on top of his, and then he heard her sharp cry of pain and saw blood spreading across the white fabric of her shoulder, the second bullet grazing her. Yet Belle did not stop for an emotion Dominic had only ever seen from highly trained fighters. She rolled off him, grabbed the nearest wooden chair, and hurled it at the gunman, knocking him off balance and making him drop his weapon. And Belle surged toward him, like a storm breaking loose, her elbow snapping into his face, her knee driving brutally into his stomach, then a flawless pivot that sent him crashing to the floor as she locked his neck in a chokehold with terrifying precision, and the second gunman raised his weapon toward her. But Dominic had already drawn his Glock and fired, hitting the man in the shoulder, and the third, realizing the ambush had collapsed, bolted for the exit, only to be taken down instantly by Marcus Webb, Dominic's bodyguard, who had heard the gunshots from outside and delivered a knockout blow to the base of the man's skull. And silence fell heavy over the restaurant, broken only by the muffled weeping of customers, the groans of the attackers, and the faint wail of approaching police sirens. And Dominic rose, his eyes never leaving Belle, who was still pinning the gunman beneath her with a perfect chokehold, her face composed as ice despite the blood soaking her shoulder. And she did not tremble, did not panic, did not behave like any ordinary woman who had just been shot, but like a warrior, someone trained to face death and overcome it. And the question struck Dominic harder than the gunshot that should have killed him. Who is she? For she was not a waitress taught self-defense by a foster father. No weekend class produced reflexes like that, precision like that, that cold focus in the heart of chaos. These were the instincts of someone who had fought hundreds of times, who had been trained to kill or be killed. And Marcus rushed to Dominic, asking if he was all right. And Dominic nodded without looking away from Belle, saying, "Get her out of here before the police arrive. To my penthouse. I need to talk to her." And Belle finally released the gunman and stood, one hand pressing her wounded shoulder. And she looked at Dominic, and in her deep brown eyes he saw something he could not decipher. Fear, perhaps, or relief, or the quiet acceptance that her mask had fallen at last. And she asked if he was hurt. Her voice strangely calm for someone who had just taken a bullet. And Dominic said, "You saved my life. Now you will tell me who you really are." And it was not a question, but a command. And they both understood that tonight more truths than either of them wished to face would be forced into the light. Dominic's penthouse sat on the top floor of an opulent tower overlooking Lake Michigan, where the lights of Chicago shimmered like a million stars scattered across the ground. And Marcus drove them back in silence, glancing into the rearview mirror now and then, with a suspicious look cast toward Belle, who sat quietly with her hand pressed against her wounded shoulder. The bleeding stopped, though the pain still throbbed, And when the elevator opened onto the penthouse level, Dominic led her inside the vast apartment with its high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling glass walls, choosing not to turn on the main lights so that only the glow of the city washed over them, creating a space that felt at once intimate and taut with unspoken tension. And he pulled out a chair by the marble kitchen island and told her to sit so he could tend to her injury. And Belle did not protest, exhaustion finally showing through her expression as he retrieved the first aid kit from the cabinet. His movements practiced the movements of a man who had done this many times before, and he said she would need to remove her shirt so he could see the wound properly. His voice neutral, but his storm-gray eyes fixed on her, and Belle hesitated only briefly, before nodding, slowly slipping off the blood-soaked white blouse to reveal a thin camisole beneath and the graze of the bullet across her shoulder. Yet that was not what made Dominic still for her. Body was a map of suffering, the scars telling stories. No words could hold a long slash across her back from shoulder to hip as though carved by something sharp. A round scar on her left shoulder from an old bullet that had healed but never disappeared, and the small scar on her wrist which he already knew now, looking almost insignificant beside the rest. And Dominic cleaned the fresh wound in silence, his touch steady, though his heartbeat thundered, because he had seen many scars in his life on fighters and enforcers and survivors. But the scars on Belle spoke of a life forged in pain and violence, in endurance beyond imagination, and as he wrapped the bandage, he finally said, "Tell me the truth this time," and Belle closed her eyes, drawing a long breath, knowing this moment would come, the moment she would have to choose between her mission and something else, something she had not yet dared to name. And she said she had once worked for the government, trained to do things ordinary people could not do. And Dominic did not look surprised, as though he had suspected it for some time, asking which agency. But she shook her head, unable to give specifics, saying only that she had left that life, or at least believed she had. And when he asked why she left, she fell silent for a moment, sorting what she could reveal from what she must hide, before saying she was tired. Tired of pretending to be someone else. Tired of violence, tired of trusting no one, that she wanted a life that felt normal even once. And Dominic took the seat across from her, his gray eyes deep and searching, as though he were reading her thoughts. And he asked why she was here in his city, in his restaurant, and Belle gave him half the truth, saying she was running from her past and that Chicago was big enough to disappear, and that Bellissimo was simply the job she found, that she had not known who he was until after she started working there. And Dominic tilted his head, not entirely convinced, yet not challenging her either. And he asked about the scar on her back, his voice gentler now. And Belle answered truthfully that it came from her second foster father, who believed a belt was the proper way to teach children. And when he asked about the bullet scar, she said it came from a mission gone wrong, 2 years earlier, a moment where she had nearly died. And Dominic rose and walked to the window, his back to her, but the tension visible in the line of his shoulders, and he said she had saved his life tonight, that she could have let him die and vanished into the chaos without anyone knowing who she was. But instead she had shoved him down and taken the bullet meant for him, and he asked why, and Belle had no answer. She dared to voice, for she had come to investigate him, to gather evidence to put him in prison. Yet when the bullet flew, her body had moved before her mind, saving the man she was meant to bring down. And she said perhaps it was because she was tired of watching people die. Her voice soft as a confession, and Dominic turned back toward her, and in the dim wash of city light something shifted in his gaze. No longer suspicion, but respect, and perhaps something deeper still. It was late, the city lights outside the glass walls still shimmering like scattered embers across the skyline. Yet the penthouse itself was wrapped in the heavy stillness of secrets on the verge of breaking open. And Dominic poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handed one to Belle, then sat across from her on the sofa, and they drank in silence for a while, letting the ache in her shoulder and the ache in both their hearts settle into something bearable, until Belle finally began to speak. Not because Dominic asked, but because she needed someone to know someone, to understand someone, to share the burden she had carried alone for 15 years. And she said she had been 12 years old. Her voice a whisper, as though she feared waking the ghosts she lived with. And that night in Miami, she had been doing homework when she heard the door kicked open. Her father, a police officer investigating a powerful criminal organization, and they had come to silence him, and Belle closed her eyes, her shoulders trembling, even though her voice remained steady, describing how she ran into the hallway and saw her father lying in a pool of blood, with his eyes still open, as if trying to tell her something he no longer had time to say, and how her mother was dragged into the living room, and Belle heard her begging, then screaming, then falling silent, and how her little brother Daniel, only 8 years old, was carried off by one of the men, calling her name again and again, until his voice faded and vanished, and she paused to take a long swallow of whiskey, as though she needed its burn to keep going, explaining how she hid in the closet for 6 hours, afraid to breathe or move. And when the police found her, she was clutching her mother's shirt, her eyes wide open yet seeing nothing, and they told her she was lucky to survive. And she let out a bitter laugh at the word lucky, as though surviving while losing everything could ever be called luck. And Dominic set his glass down and moved to sit beside her, not touching her, but close enough for her to feel she was no longer alone. And he asked softly about her brother, whether he had ever been found. And Belle shook her head as tears finally slipped down her cheeks. Tears she thought she no longer had the ability to shed, and she said Daniel had been sold into a trafficking ring, that she searched for him for years, and when she finally found his file, she learned he had died 10 years old, dead from exhaustion and malnutrition in an illegal factory in Mexico. Her little brother dying alone with no one to hold him, calling for a sister who never came. And Dominic felt something break inside him for the woman beside him, for he knew that pain, knew what it meant to lose the people you loved and be powerless to save them. And he told her he had been 22 when he lost his parents in a highway crash, caused by a drunk driver who fled the scene, and that they died instantly. And that a phone call at 2 in the morning had reshaped his entire existence. And Belle looked at him with reddened eyes as he said Lucia had been only 2 years old, crying for her mother through the night, while he had no way to explain that she would never return. And he held his baby sister in that empty house, 22 years old, with no money, no experience, and a child entirely dependent on him, and he looked down at his hands, the same hands that had done terrible things to keep his promise to her, and he said he had sworn he would protect Lucia at any cost, and any cost had meant exactly that. And he entered the criminal world not out of hunger for power, but out of desperation to buy milk and medicine for a child, telling himself each step into darkness was temporary, telling himself it was the last one, doing it all for Lucia. Until 15 years later, he looked at the path behind him and no longer recognized the man he had become. And Belle placed her hand over his, a small gesture yet vast in meaning, saying they were both victims of circumstance pushed into lives. They did not choose, forced to do things they did not want to do in order to survive, to protect the ones they loved. And Dominic turned his hand to hold hers, and together they sat in silence. Two wounded souls who had finally found one another in the middle of the night, while outside the city continued glowing life, pressing forward. Yet inside, the penthouse time seemed to stop, and for the first time in many years, neither Belle nor Dominic felt alone. 3 days after the night they shared their past, Dominic called Belle and asked if she wanted to take a walk, not in the restaurant and not in the dim shadows of his penthouse, but outside under sunlight like ordinary people. And Belle agreed without thinking, which frightened her more than any mission she had ever carried out. And they met at Navy Pier in the afternoon, when the autumn sun cast a golden shimmer over Lake Michigan, and the breeze carried the faint scent of water, and Dominic, in a black leather jacket and jeans, looked younger, lighter, as though unburdening himself that night had lifted some of the weight from his shoulders, while Belle, in a simple floral dress, with her hair loose instead of tied back as it was at work, made him stop for a beat, when he saw her, as though he could not believe his own eyes. And he told her she was beautiful, with the quiet honesty of a man unused to speaking such things. And Belle felt her cheeks warm with an emotion she thought she had long forgotten, and they walked along the lakeside with slow, unhurried steps, as though time itself finally belonged to them, surrounded by children's laughter music, drifting from cafes and the gentle sound of waves kissing the shore. The ordinary life both of them had longed for yet never had, and Dominic asked if she could do anything or go anywhere, what she would choose. And Belle looked out at the expanse of blue stretching to the horizon and said she wanted a peaceful place, a small town where no one knew her name, where she might open a cafe and wake each morning without checking whether someone was following her, where she could sleep each night without nightmares, and she asked what he wished for. And Dominic smiled the rare smile Belle had only seen when he spoke of his sister, saying he wanted to sit in the front row at Lucia's medical school graduation. To see her in a white coat saving lives instead of watching people die, the way he had for so long, and he wanted her to be proud of her brother without ever needing to know the things he had done. And they stopped at a stone bench overlooking the lake and sat with their shoulders touching the late sunlight, washing everything in warm shades of gold and amber. And in that suspended moment, the criminal underworld, the FBI assignment, the secrets and the lies all seemed to dissolve until only a man and a woman remained, two wounded souls who had found each other in a harsh world. And Belle asked softly whether people like them could ever have a normal life. And Dominic looked at her with storm-gray eyes softened to the calmness of the lake before them and said he did not know. But for the first time in many years, he wanted to try. And they looked at each other, and the air between them seemed to narrow and fold in on itself. And Dominic lifted his hand to her cheek, his touch feather light, and she did not pull away or turn aside, but closed her eyes and leaned into his palm as though she had been waiting all her life. And when their lips met, Belle felt the ground beneath her collapse and rebuild at once. The kiss gentle yet filled with everything they could not say, years of loneliness, the need to belong, fear woven tightly with hope. And when they parted, she opened her eyes to find his gray gaze on her, as though she were the most precious thing he had ever seen, and she understood she had fallen into a depth from which there was no return, that she was in love with him. She, FBI agent Isabel Navarro, in love with the very man she had been sent to destroy, and she had come to dismantle his life, yet could no longer imagine hers without him, and it was the greatest mistake she had ever made, and the truest thing she had ever felt. And as they walked back hand in hand, Belle kept silent, fighting the storm inside her, torn between mission and love, between justice and happiness, knowing only that whatever choice she made, she would lose a piece of herself. Dominic's happiness lasted only 2 days, 2 brief days in which he allowed himself to believe in a future, to believe in the possibility of walking out of the shadows, to believe in the fragile growing bond between him and Belle. And then everything collapsed as swiftly and violently as a building losing its foundation. For that afternoon, Dominic was in his office when his phone vibrated and Marcus called, his voice shaking in a way Dominic had never heard from the man who had guarded him loyally for years. And he said Boss Lucia's car was attacked on the way home from school. Tony is dead. And they took her, and the world stopped. The breath torn from Dominic's lungs as though someone had reached into his chest and ripped out his heart, because Lucia, his little sister, he had sworn to protect at any cost, the 2-year-old child he once held through the night. Now 17, with their mother's smile and clear eyes, untouched by darkness, had been dragged into the very world he had tried all his life to keep her away from. And he drove home like a madman, calling everyone in his organization, commanding a citywide search. But before any report could come in, his phone, lit with a video message from an unknown number, and with shaking hands he opened it, seeing Lucia bound to a chair, her eyes blindfolded, her mouth sealed with tape, her hair disheveled, her school uniform rumpled her small shoulders, trembling with sobs that cut through the speakers like knives. And then Nathan Moretti stepped into frame, wearing the smug smile of a man who believed he had already won, saying, "Caruso, your sister is adorable. It would be such a shame if something happened to her." And Dominic clenched his teeth so hard he tasted blood gripping the phone until its casing creaked, demanding to know what Nathan wanted. And Nathan said he wanted everything: territory, business operations, partner lists, bank accounts, that Dominic would sign over the entire empire to the Moretti family in exchange for Lucia's safe return, giving him 48 hours. And then he grabbed Lucia by the hair and yanked her head back, her muffled scream echoing through the speakers, and added that Dominic should not think about going to the police or the FBI because they had people there, and any suspicious move would cost Lucia far more than her freedom. And the video ended, leaving Dominic standing in his living room with the phone slipping from his hand as his strength drained from him, for he had spent 15 years building this empire, committing unforgivable acts, selling pieces of his soul to demons, all for Lucia. And now that very empire was being used to tear her from him, and he sank onto the sofa with his head in his hands. And for the first time since the night his parents died, Dominic Caruso cried not the sound of weakness, but the sound of a man who had been strong for far too long and had finally reached the breaking point, and he knew he would sign everything, surrender everything, territory, money, power. For none of it mattered if it meant losing his sister, yet he also knew the Morettis knew Frank, and Nathan knew that even if he gave them everything, they would still kill Lucia to avenge the years they had been overshadowed by the Caruso name, and he needed a plan. He needed someone who could help him, someone outside the collapsing circle he could no longer trust. And in that moment he thought of Belle, the woman with skills that did not belong to the ordinary world. The woman who had saved his life in the restaurant. The one person he trusted as everything else was falling apart. Belle received Dominic's message while she was in the small apartment she rented near downtown, the place she used as her discreet point of contact with the FBI. And the message was only 4 words: I need you. Now. And she knew instantly that something was terribly wrong, because Dominic Caruso was not a man who asked for help, and the desperation woven into those few words made her drop everything and head straight for his penthouse, calling her FBI handler. On the way to report the situation, and the voice on the other end confirmed they already knew Lucia Caruso had been kidnapped, and said this could be a golden opportunity, advising her to let Caruso and the Morettis destroy each other, and that the Bureau would move in afterwards to sweep up what remained, telling her to stay on mission and gather more evidence, not to intervene. And Belle hung up without answering, her mind spinning through calculations, possibilities, consequences, because this was what she had waited 15 years for the Moretti family. The monsters who had murdered her parents and sold her little brother into hell were now at war with Caruso. And if she allowed them to tear each other apart, she could have everything she had ever wanted: revenge and a completed mission. But then there was Lucia, the 17-year-old girl she had never met but had heard Dominic speak of with the full aching love of an older brother. A girl who wanted to become a doctor, who wanted to save lives, who knew nothing of the darkness her brother walked through. A girl now held somewhere in terror, alone just as Daniel had been. And when Belle reached the penthouse, the sight before her made her chest tighten. For Dominic sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his head bowed. The man she once believed cold and ruthless, now looking like an abandoned child. And when he lifted his head at the sound of her steps, she saw his gray eyes reddened and his face drawn as though he had aged 10 years in a matter of hours. And he said, "Lucia." They took Lucia, his voice ragged, and she sat beside him as he told her everything. The threatening video: Nathan Moretti's demands the 48-hour deadline, and he hid nothing. Not his despair, not his fear, not the raw anguish of a brother terrified of losing the person he loved most. And he said he would sign everything, surrender territory, money, power, for none of it mattered to him. But he knew they would not keep their word, that they would kill Lucia regardless. And he said he needed help, that he needed someone with skills he did not have, that she was the only person he could trust. And Belle looked at him, and in that moment she did not see a target. She saw herself 15 years earlier, a child who had lost everything, crying in the dark, praying someone would come. And she saw Daniel, her 8-year-old brother, dragged away into the night, never to return, and no one came for him. No one arrived in time. But perhaps she could come in time for Lucia. Perhaps she could save this girl the way no one had saved her brother. And she heard herself say, "I will help you," knowing she had just thrown away 15 years of preparation, 6 years in the FBI, and every chance of completing her mission. Yet she also knew that for the first time in her life, she was doing something right, not out of duty or vengeance, but out of love. And Dominic looked at her, a fragile spark of hope lighting his eyes, and he asked whether she could help him. Save his sister, and Belle nodded her hand, closing firmly around his, saying she had skills he did not know about, and that she believed it was time she used them for something that truly mattered. Belle rose from her seat, stepped to the table, and powered on Dominic's computer, her fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard as she accessed databases no ordinary waitress would ever know existed. And Dominic stood behind her in silence, watching. And in that moment he understood with absolute clarity that this woman held far more secrets than he had ever imagined. And Belle said without pausing her hands that she had not merely worked for the government. She had been an operative trained in infiltration, reconnaissance hand-to-hand, combat and weapons trained to read satellite maps, to disable security systems, to extract people from places designed to keep them trapped. And Dominic did not ask why she had hidden this, nor did he ask what her original purpose had been in coming into his life, for those questions could wait, and only one thing mattered now. And he asked what she needed, and she told him she needed everything he had on the Moretti family, their warehouses, their properties, any location they might use to hold a hostage, and that she needed to speak with his most trusted men. And Dominic called Marcus Webb, who arrived at the penthouse within 20 minutes, tense and alert, though the moment he saw Belle taking command of the room like a general in the field. He looked to his boss with a silent question, and Dominic said simply that she was on their side and that he was to follow her lead. And Marcus nodded without protest, for in their world the trust of the boss was all a man required. And Belle spread a large map of the city across the table, marking the locations Dominic's scouts had confirmed as Moretti properties, explaining that they would not keep Lucia in any obvious place. Not a home, not an office, not a well-known business, but somewhere isolated, hard to reach, easy to guard. And she pointed to a location in the southern outskirts of Chicago and asked what it was. And Marcus said it was an old warehouse once belonging to a shipping company that had gone bankrupt 5 years earlier, now owned on paper by a shell corporation, but known to be under Moretti control. And Belle marked it, asking how many entrances it had, and Marcus replied 2, the front door and the loading dock and back, surrounded by empty land with no structures within 300 meters. And she asked about security cameras, and he said the last intel showed 6 exterior cameras with unknown interior systems, and Belle studied the satellite view for several long moments, her mind running through hundreds of scenarios before lifting her gaze with an edge of steel in her eyes and saying they would not enter through the front or back, pointing instead to a point on the rooftop where the ventilation system ran, explaining that old warehouses often had vents large enough for a person to fit through, that she would infiltrate from above, disable the cameras, and open the door from the inside. And she turned to Marcus and asked how many men he could trust completely, and he said 4, 5 counting himself, and she said it was enough. Then looked to Dominic and told him he would not be part of the initial entry, and before he could object, she said they wanted him, that if they saw him they would use Lucia as a shield or kill her immediately, that he would wait at the extraction point and only come in when they had secured the space. And Dominic wanted to argue, wanted to say she was his sister and he should be the one to save her. But he looked into Belle's eyes and saw the cold professionalism of someone who had done this many times before, someone who understood exactly what she was doing, and he said he trusted her, that he placed his sister's life in her hands. And Belle touched his cheek, her fingers trembling with the emotion she fought to contain, and she promised she would bring Lucia back to him. And they spent the next 3 hours refining the plan, assigning roles, checking equipment, and Marcus proved he deserved Dominic's trust by working with Belle with perfect discipline, asking no unnecessary questions, showing no resistance to her leadership. And when all was ready, night had settled over the city, and Belle, dressed in black, her hair tied back, a gun holstered at her side, and a small blade strapped to her boot. No longer the gentle waitress with the quiet smile, but a warrior stepping into battle for something she finally believed was worth fighting for. The warehouse lay silent under the darkness, lit only by a few dim yellow lights flickering across the entrance. And Belle watched from a distance through an infrared scope, counting 4 guards outside and at least 3 figures moving inside through the narrow windows, then signaled to Marcus and his team before making her way alone toward the back of the building, where the old ventilation system sat on the roof, and climbing up was effortless for someone with her training. And within 5 minutes she was flat on the metal panels, unscrewing the grate of the vent, and the shaft was cramped and filthy, but she had crawled through, far worse, inching forward without a sound as she peered through the slivers of space into the warehouse below, a wide room cluttered with crates and pallets. And in the center, Lucia sat tied to a chair, her hands bound behind her, her eyes still covered, though the tape had been removed from her mouth, her small frame trembling with soft sobs that seemed to vibrate through Belle's bones. and two guards stood near her with guns in hand, and Belle traced the positions of the cameras, counting four, then dropped quietly from the vent onto the top of the electrical cabinet, drew her knife, and sliced through the camera cables, plunging the room into electronic blindness, and the guards panicked just as Belle moved, striking from the shadows, dropping the first with a punch to the throat before he could shout, spinning to kick the gun from the second man's hand, and bringing him down with an elbow to the temple. Both collapsing within 10 seconds, and she sprinted to Lucia and sliced through the ropes, and Lucia asked, her voice shaking, as Belle pulled off the blindfold, who she was, and Belle said she was a friend of her brother's, and they needed to leave immediately, guiding her toward the back door, which she had already unlocked from the inside, just as Marcus and his men stormed in. Taking down the remaining guards outside, everything unfolding so smoothly that Belle almost did not trust it, and just as she feared, the moment they neared escape, a black car screeched to a halt at the gate, and Frank Moretti stepped out with Nathan and four heavily armed guards behind him. Frank, a 60-year-old man with silver hair and eyes as cold as a serpent, the man who had ordered the murders of Belle's family 15 years earlier, and he roared that no one was to leave his gaze sweeping over Dominic's men before landing on Belle, and something in his face shifted surprise, followed by recognition, and then a cruel smile. And at that same moment, Dominic appeared from the extraction point, unable to wait. Once he heard gunfire, and he ran to Lucia, pulling her into his arms and checking frantically for injuries. And Lucia, crying, told him she was safe because Belle had saved her and had taken down the guards on her own. And Dominic looked at Belle with gratitude overflowing in his eyes. But before he could speak, Frank's voice cracked across the night like thunder as he said, "Isabel Navarro." And he laughed, a jagged crow-like sound that cut through the darkness, saying he could not believe it, that she was the daughter of Thomas Navarro, the cop who had tried to bring down his empire 15 years ago, saying he had checked her history and found the blank pages where her childhood should have been, confirming she was the ghost who vanished the night her father died. And Dominic froze, still holding Lucia, but staring at Belle with disbelief, asking what Frank meant. And Belle felt the ground vanish beneath her as she fought to find words, but Frank continued, ruthlessly announcing that she was FBI agent Isabel Navarro, sent to infiltrate Dominic's organization, saying Dominic had slept beside the enemy without knowing, saying she had come to put him in prison, and he had been foolish enough to trust her. And Dominic looked at Belle with storm-gray eyes darkened to the depth of a moonless night, and in them Belle saw a pain greater than betrayal, the shattering of a man who had opened his heart after years of silence, only to feel it torn apart, and he asked if it was true, his voice cold yet trembling at the edges, and Belle opened her mouth to answer. But in that instant, Nathan raised his gun at her, and chaos exploded, Marcus and his team firing at the Moretti men, while Dominic shielded Lucia and dragged her to safety. And amid the gunfire and shouts and crashing metal, Belle was struck from behind by one of Frank's guards, the blow sharp and brutal, and the last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her was Dominic's eyes fixed on her with anguish and disbelief, looking at her as though she were a stranger he had never known at all. Belle awoke in darkness with a throbbing ache at the base of her skull and the metallic taste of blood on her tongue. And when she tried to move, she realized her hands were tied tightly behind the chair and her ankles shackled to its metal legs, the small damp room around her lit only by a single trembling bulb that hung from the ceiling, and she had no sense of how long she had been unconscious. No sense of whether Dominic or Lucia had escaped. No sense of what waited for her next, and the iron door creaked open as Frank Moretti stepped inside with Nathan behind him, the old man dragging a chair close until he sat so near she could smell the whiskey and cigar smoke clinging to his skin, his serpent-cold eyes savoring her like prey he intended to toy with before killing. And he spoke her name slowly, Isabel Navarro, as though tasting the syllables, saying he had wondered for 15 years what became of the little girl hiding in the closet that night, saying it seemed she had grown into an FBI agent who had returned to find him. And Belle replied only with a stare filled with the hatred she had carried for 15 years. But Frank did not need her voice, for he had not come to question her, but to torture her. And his weapon was not a knife or a gun, but memory. And he asked if she wanted to know the details of that night, tilting his head with a cruel smile, as he recounted how her father, Thomas Navarro, A policeman who believed he could challenge Frank's empire had uncovered evidence of his human trafficking network and intended to take it to court, and that Frank had been forced to deal with him, saying he sent men to the house at 10 o'clock that night. And her father opened the door, thinking it was a neighbor, and the first bullet struck his chest and the second his head, and he fell before he understood what was happening, and tears slipped down Belle's cheeks despite her efforts to hold them back. And Frank went on, his eyes bright with sick delight as he described how her mother had screamed and begged and pleaded for her children, and how it took his men more than an hour to finish with her, saying women were always more stubborn than men, and Belle whispered for him to stop. But he did not. Not yet, for he had saved his most poisonous blow for last, and he spoke of Daniel, the 8-year-old boy who had cried and called her name all the way to the holding site. Belle, Belle. I'm scared, where is Belle? And Belle squeezed her eyes shut, trying to keep the images from rising. But his voice slithered through every corner of her mind, saying he sold the boy to a trafficking line in Mexico, where children like him fetched a high price, but he had been too fragile, unable to withstand the heavy labor. And 2 years later, Frank received word that the child had died in an illegal factory. 10 years old, starved and exhausted, dying alone with no one beside him. And Belle broke then a raw, guttural sob, tearing free from the 12-year-old still trapped inside her. The child who had sat in a closet praying someone would come, and she had read the case file, had known Daniel was gone, but hearing it from the man who caused it was a wound of an entirely different depth. And Frank stood looking down at her with contempt as he said she had come here thinking she could take revenge, thinking she could bring justice. But she was weak, just like her family, and she would die. As they had then turned toward the door, pausing with a final glance over his shoulder to add that her lover, Dominic Caruso, would be drawn in by her, and Frank would kill them both, ending 2 bloodlines at once. And the door slammed shut, leaving Belle alone with the ghosts of her past and the terrible shape of what might come. And she thought of Dominic, of the pain in his eyes when he learned the truth, and she wished she could tell him that her feelings were real, that whatever purpose had brought her into his life, her heart had changed, but she knew she might never have the chance to say it. Dominic sat in the darkened penthouse without turning on a single light, without touching the whiskey on the counter, staring out at the glittering spread of Chicago beyond the glass. And though Lucia was safe and sleeping in the guest room, with 2 guards stationed outside her door, his mind would not settle, replaying again and again. The image of Belle being struck and dragged away, intertwined with Frank Moretti's revelation of who she truly was, an FBI agent sent to investigate him to bring him down. And he wondered whether everything between them, the conversations, the shared secrets, the quiet confessions, the kiss by the lake, had been a lie. Yet if it had been a lie, why had she risked her life for Lucia? Why had she wept when she spoke of her brother? Why had she looked at him with such raw pain when her identity was exposed? And the doorbell pulled him from the spiral of questions. Marcus announcing that Vincent DeLuca was asking to see him. And though every instinct Dominic possessed screamed warning, he allowed the man in, and Vincent entered like a ghost. His face hollowed, his eyes bloodshot as though robbed of sleep for nights, standing in the center of the room, unable to sit or meet Dominic's gaze, saying he had come to confess, and perhaps to atone if such a thing was still possible. And Dominic remained silent, watching the man he had trusted as a father for 12 years crumble under the weight of his own guilt. And Vincent said he was the one who betrayed him, that 2 years earlier he had fallen into debt with the Morettis, and they had threatened his son and newborn grandchild unless he provided information, and he admitted he had given them. Lucia's schedule had helped them plan the kidnapping, and Dominic rose to his feet with his fists clenched, while Vincent's voice broke as he said Dominic had trusted him, had treated him like family, and he had repaid that trust with treachery, that there was no excuse, no explanation that could make it right. Only the truth that he had been a coward who protected his own blood by destroying another man's. And Dominic asked why he had come, whether he sought forgiveness. But Vincent shook his head and said he had come to deliver information, placing a small USB drive on the table, explaining it contained all the evidence on the Moretti Empire, the trafficking network, the laundering operations, the murders, and the list of corrupt officials they owned enough to lock Frank and Nathan away for life, and that Belle was being held in the basement of Frank's northern estate to be used as bait to lure Dominic in so they could kill them both. And Dominic looked at the USB and then at Vincent asking what he wanted in return. And Vincent said nothing, that when he left he would go directly to the FBI and turn himself in, confessing everything about the Morettis and everything he had done, accepting whatever punishment came. And when Dominic asked why now, Vincent said that when he saw Dominic holding Lucia after she was rescued, he remembered why he had once respected him, because Dominic had always done everything to protect his sister without ever betraying the people who trusted him, because Dominic had held a line Vincent himself had crossed. And for the first time, Vincent met his eyes and told him that Belle had indeed come with a mission to investigate him. But she had risked her life to save Lucia, even though it destroyed her career and exposed her that such an act did not come from deceit, but from love. And Vincent turned to leave, pausing at the doorway to say that Dominic should save her and do the right thing. The thing Vincent should have done long ago. And the door closed softly, leaving Dominic alone with the USB in his hand, and a decision before him that could change everything. Dominic held the USB in his hand, turning it over as though weighing not just a device, but the fate of his entire life, aware that the evidence inside could destroy the Moretti family, but could just as easily drag him into the abyss with them. For if he handed it to the FBI, he would have to confess everything about his organization and the things he had done for 15 years. And prison was a real possibility. The loss of everything he had built was a certainty. Yet if he did nothing, Belle would die, the woman who had saved his sister's life, the woman who had looked into his eyes and seen the person beneath the armor, the woman who had made him believe a normal life might be possible. And though she had come with a mission, though she was FBI and perhaps an enemy, he could not let her die. And the soft sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts as Lucia appeared in the doorway of the living room, with her hair tousled and her eyes swollen from crying, unable to sleep after what had happened the night before. And she crossed the room to sit beside him, saying she kept thinking about Belle and asking where she was, and Dominic finally told her the truth, that Belle had been taken and was being held by the Morettis. And Lucia looked at him with wide, clear eyes and insisted he save her, because Belle had saved her, describing how she had been tied up and terrified in the dark room, unable to breathe, until Belle appeared like an angel, taking down 2 guards in less than 10 seconds, holding her and telling her everything would be all right, and that her brother was waiting outside. And Dominic saw the admiration shining in his sister's face. And he told her Belle was FBI, that she had come to investigate him and put him in prison. And Lucia fell silent for a moment, absorbing the revelation, before shaking her head and saying she did not care why Belle had come. Only that when she had been most afraid and certain she would die, Belle had risked her life to save her, and that such an act did not come from someone evil, but from someone good, regardless of what their job was. And she took Dominic's hand and met his gaze with a maturity far beyond her 17 years, saying she knew he had done many things to protect her, that she was not naive, that she knew the school tuition and the penthouse, and their life did not come from ordinary investments. And Dominic felt his heart tighten as he realized she had known for a long time, but had never confronted him because she did not want to hurt him, and Lucia told him she needed him to do the right thing. Not for her, but for himself, saying he had lived in darkness too long, and it was time to step into the light, no matter the cost. And Dominic looked at the girl who had once been a 2-year-old child trembling in his arms, and now stood as a young woman, wise and brave. And he understood that perhaps the best way to protect her now was not with violence, but with truth, with surrender, with change. And he stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city slowly brightening with dawn's Chicago, the place where he had built an empire from nothing, the place where he had become a man he never meant to be, and he knew it was time to end it. Turning back to Lucia with eyes full of resolve, as he said he would save Belle, and he would do the right thing, that he would hand the evidence to the FBI, confess everything, accept whatever consequences came, testify against the Morettis and bring down their empire, even if it meant bringing down his own. And Lucia rose and embraced him, whispering that she was proud of him, and Dominic held her, feeling a portion of the burden he had carried for 15 years finally lift. Then he pulled out his phone and called Marcus, telling him to prepare the team because they were raiding the Moretti estate that night, and to contact the FBI to inform them that Dominic Caruso wished to cooperate in exchange for saving their agent. And on the other end of the line, Marcus hesitated before asking if he was certain, because this would change everything. And Dominic looked toward the rising sun over Chicago and said quietly that changing everything was exactly what he intended. Night fell over Chicago like a velvet curtain drawn across the sky, concealing what was about to unfold. And Frank Moretti's mansion stood in the northern outskirts like a fortified relic of his empire. 3 stories high, with towering walls and cameras, watching every angle, the last stronghold of a criminal dynasty built over 40 years. And Dominic sat in an armored car 200 meters away, an earpiece connecting him to the FBI and Marcus's team. Their unprecedented cooperation, marking the first time a Chicago crime lord joined forces with federal agents to bring down another for tonight, was not about territory or power, but about saving a woman and ending a war that had lasted far too long. And Agent Harrison, a middle-aged man with a calm but wary voice, asked over the line whether Dominic was certain of his information. And Dominic answered that Bell was in the eastern basement with 2 access points, one from the kitchen and one from the garage. And after a brief silence, Harrison said the FBI would go in first, and Dominic must wait until called. But Dominic stepped out of the car and said he was going in with them because she had been captured because of him, and he would be the one to bring her out. And before Harrison could object, Dominic cut the line and moved toward the mansion with Marcus and 4 of his men approaching from the rear, where the wall was lower and the cameras sparser. And as FBI sirens erupted at the front gate, drawing the guards' attention, Dominic's team scaled the wall unseen, slipping into the mansion amid the explosion of gunfire, shouts, and breaking glass. And Dominic cared nothing for the chaos above his focus, fixed solely on the basement where they stormed down through the kitchen entrance and took down 2 guards before they could react. The hallway dim and damp with the smell of mold and something else, the copper tang of blood, tightening Dominic's chest as he imagined what Belle might have endured. And they found her in the last room tied to a chair, her face bruised and her lips cracked, but her dark eyes glowing with relief when she saw him. And Dominic rushed to her side, cutting the ropes with trembling hands, asking if she was hurt. And Belle looked up with tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered that she had thought he would never want to see her again after learning the truth. And Dominic pulled her into his arms gently but fiercely, as though afraid she might vanish, telling her she had saved his sister, that she had risked everything for Lucia, even though it destroyed her mission, that he did not care why she had come, only that she had stood beside him when he needed it most. And Marcus's warning shout turned Dominic just in time to see Nathan Moretti charge in with a gun. But before he could fire, Belle moved, her instincts sharper than her pain, as she kicked the weapon from his hand and used her momentum to send him crashing to the floor, where Marcus restrained him while Belle collapsed against Dominic, exhausted but still managing a faint smile, as she asked whether she still had her skills. And they helped her upstairs where the battle had ended, and Moretti's guards were either captured or dead. And Frank Moretti stood in the middle of the living room with his hands cuffed behind him, his aged face twisted with rage as he saw Dominic emerging from the basement, carrying Belle, shouting that Dominic had betrayed their world by cooperating with the FBI and was nothing now. And Dominic replied that he no longer wished to be anything in that world, that he had been done with it for a long time, and that tonight he ended it, both Moretti's legacy and his own. And Agent Harrison stepped forward saying Dominic had kept his word and that the evidence he provided was enough to imprison the entire Moretti family for life. And Dominic nodded and slowly raised his hand, saying Dominic Caruso, voluntarily surrendered and was ready to cooperate fully with the FBI regarding every operation he had led for 15 years. And the cuffs clicked cold around his wrists, but instead of fear or regret, he felt only relief as the burden of those years lifted, and Belle watched him being taken away, with tears streaming down her face, wanting to speak but unable to find words. And Dominic turned once more, his storm gray eyes, now as calm as a lake, after a tempest, telling her to take care of herself, and if she could, to tell Lucia that her brother had finally done the right thing. 3 years later, Seattle welcomed Belle with its soft, misting rain and gentle gray skies, so different from the turbulent Chicago that lived in her memories, and her small cafe on a quiet corner of Capitol Hill looked out through wide windows onto a tree-lined street where maple leaves turned warm shades of amber and gold, and she named it Light, a simple name, carrying profound meaning for a woman who had finally stepped out of the darkness after 15 lost years, and she stood behind the counter with her dark hair loose over her shoulders instead of pulled tight as it once had been. Her smile no longer a mask, but the genuine expression of a soul at peace. And after the rescue, the FBI had granted her extended leave to heal her body and mind, time she used for therapy, revisiting the ghosts she had fled for so long, learning for the first time to speak of Daniel without crying, to speak of her parents without feeling guilty for surviving. And when she grew strong enough, she resigned and used her savings to open this little cafe, the dream she once shared with Dominic by the lake. And the bell over the door chimed as Lucia entered with her long dark hair tied back and a backpack on her shoulder, her smile bright with the confidence of a 20-year-old who was excelling in her third year of pre-med studies at the university, visiting Belle each month, sometimes staying an entire week, and their bond had grown into the sisterhood. Both had lacked in their lives, and they sat by the window as Lucia talked about difficult classes and new friends, and her dream of becoming a pediatrician to care for children who suffered as she once had, and Belle listened with quiet pride. Then asked the same question she asked every time, whether there was news of Dominic, and Lucia smiled mysteriously and told her to ask him herself. And before Belle could understand, the bell chimed again. And she looked up and felt her heart stop for a beat as Dominic stood in the doorway. No longer the man she remembered in dark Armani suits with cold, stormy eyes, but a man in a simple brown leather jacket with slightly longer hair and a face no longer hardened by the weight of an empire, though his gray eyes were the same. And when they met hers, she saw a peace she had never seen in him before. And she breathed the words that escaped like a whispered prayer, that he was free. And Dominic stepped toward her, closing the distance of 3 long years with each step, as he explained that his cooperation had helped the FBI dismantle several major criminal networks, and he had been granted reduced sentencing and early release under supervision, and that the first thing he did upon walking out was search for her. And they stood facing each other a single step apart, but separated by what felt like a lifetime. And Belle's tears trembled as she apologized for coming into his life under false pretenses, but Dominic gently brushed away a tear and told her she had come to investigate him, but had stayed because she loved him, that she had destroyed her own mission to save his sister, that she had taught him redemption was possible, and it was never too late to choose the right path, and that she had nothing to apologize for. And then he said he loved her, that he had loved her since the night she told him they were 2 wounded souls trying to survive, and that he had spent every night of those 3 years in his cell thinking of her, of them, of the future he wanted to build. And Belle needed no more words as she stepped into his arms, and their lips met with a tenderness that felt like all the fractured pieces inside her were finally made whole. And Lucia wiped happy tears from her cheeks, saying she had kept the secret for a week because Dominic made her promise not to spoil the surprise. And laughter filled the small cafe, mingling with the scent of coffee and the soft patter of Seattle rain, and 3 people shaped by 3 different kinds of pain finally found one another and found family. And Dominic stayed in Seattle, working beside Belle in the cafe and learning the ordinary life he once believed impossible, while Lucia continued her studies and visited whenever she could. And the small apartment above the cafe became the home none of them had ever truly had. Not a fairy tale or a miracle, but simply 2 people who chose to walk out of darkness and toward the light together. And the story of Dominic and Belle was not merely a romance between 2 souls from opposing worlds, but a tale of redemption of the human capacity for change, no matter how long one has walked the wrong path. A reminder that the past does not define us, and every new day offers the chance to choose what is right. And Dominic learned that protecting his sister meant becoming the kind of man she could be proud of, and Belle learned that forgiveness did not mean forgetting, but refusing to let the past control the future. And together they proved that love, true love, can grow in the darkest places and heal even the deepest wounds. And to those who have listened to this story from beginning to end, thank you. And if it touched your heart or reflected a part of your own journey, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you will not miss the stories to come. And a single like or share will help this tale reach more hearts that may need to hear that change is possible and hope survives even in life's darkest hours. And the narrator invites you to share your thoughts below which character you resonated with, whether you too have faced moments when you had to choose between the easy road and the right one, and wishes you health peace. And days filled with light like Bell's Cafe in Seattle, reminding you that after every storm there is always light and it is never too late to begin again, and bids you farewell until the next story.